Hello, GWL2 students. This video is on Phillis Wheatley. Very important poet that we should know when we look at American history. And what's interesting to know, and maybe I'll mention this tomorrow in class, tomorrow for me, not tomorrow for you, because you'll watch this after tomorrow. Anyway, that when we look at Phillis Wheatley and Anne Bradstreet, John Winthrop, and Jonathan Edwards, we talk about American literature, these actually are all people who lived prior to the American Revolution. And so these are very much still British citizens, if you will. So you have to kind of remember that about their time period. So definitely a part of American literature and a heritage, but they predate the American Revolution. I'm going to share my screen with you. We're going to just pop up a few slides on Phillis Wheatley. As you might be able to figure out, I'm not a huge PowerPoint person. I don't love it, but I'm going to throw up some slides with some pictures and a few things. Mostly if you're taking notes, I'd like you to fill in. I'm not giving you a ton of notes on the slides. I don't like to put a lot of text up there, but I am going to talk. So feel free to fill in details as I share this screen with you. So here we go. Can we find it? Yep, there we are. We're going to look at a poem by a woman named Phillis Wheatley. Really a fascinating person. Man, it would be really cool to sit down and talk with her, I think. And one thing that's really important to note as we look back at these real people, you're just seeing this tiny little snapshot. We know so very little about their lives. And we're also looking back on them. And moderns, I don't know if you've noticed this about our culture, maybe you haven't, but we live in this cancel culture where anything that goes against the talking points of the day has been canceled, but especially things of American history. For some reason, it just gets a bad rap in the academic community. Local schools, public schools, universities, in the academia world, very much has kind of tried to obliterate American history and not teach American literature or history. It's kind of a shame, but I think it has to do with this idea that as moderns, we look back at the things in the past with disdain, like they did everything wrong. And I think that we have to approach the literature that we're going to read this year with a good deal of humility, and we need to enter into their world. Their world is different than our world, and we need to be able to approach it with those eyes. I'm reading a fascinating book, a biography on Jonathan Edwards, written by George Marsden. I'll bring it tomorrow and show you guys. But I added a quote to my commonplace book from this book that I'm reading, and I think it applies to the literature that we look at. George Marsden, this author, says, if we can enter imaginatively into another time, another place, and into experiences of people different from ourselves, we have achieved one of the goals of literature. That we have to be careful and humbly approach the literature that has been passed on to us. I think it's really easy in this time, this place, as moderns, to be very critical of everything. And I would just encourage you maybe to not buy into that modern assumption that everything in the past is bad or wrong, that anything about patriarchy is wrong. But let's humbly approach the literature that we read and look for the good and look for perhaps what contributions the people from the past have given us and what we can build on. So Phillis Wheatley, let me tell you about her. She is just a really fascinating person. She was a household name. She became famous in her lifetime as a poet. In fact, she is the first published African-American poet. So she has that notoriety. And other people, especially in London, saw her as a celebrity of sorts. and hailed her. One person even wrote, may have been Voltaire. I could be saying that wrong. I have to check the book I read. Said something about how she was the most famous Black person of the time. That's my daughter. Okay. I'll double check my facts on that. But anyway, so obviously a very, very celebrated individual. And her story is quite fascinating. She was a slave, and she came over on a slave ship from Africa and landed in Boston. And when she got off the ship, the slave holder, trader, didn't think that she was going to sell for very much. He offered her for a very low price. She was very sickly. She was emaciated. She was a young child. And one account that I read said that she was only wrapped in a carpet piece. Like she didn't even have clothes, right? How sad. So here she was, this very young child. And a prominent Boston family named the Wheatleys bought her. She's named Phillis after the ship that she came over on. The ship was named Phillis. So is bought by this family, given the name Phillis Wheatley. Well, very early on, they discovered that she's kind of this precocious child. They clothe her, feed her, take care of her. And they find her writing, I think, the alphabet on the wall of the home. And rather than punish her, they realize what a bright young girl she is. And so they educate her. The Wheatleys had other children. Their oldest daughter, I think Mary, was 18 years old, and they asked her to be the tutor for Phillis. And so they start to teach Phillis and educate her. And she was given the kind of education that even other Americans her age, colonial people her age, didn't have. I mean, if you were a wealthy person and you could afford a tutor that would instruct you in the classics, it was a privilege. And Phillis Wheatley was instructed in Greek and Latin. She could both read and write those things, and read very widely. Homer, Virgil, Hesiod, Ovid. Who else did she read? She was just steeped in the classics. She was very familiar with John Milton, Paradise Lost, and Alexander Pope. And so she was very, very well educated, and she was immersed in literature, immersed in poetry. And so she started writing poetry very young. In fact, I think she had her first poem published when she was 13 years old. And so here she is in this wealthy family, not living the life of a slave, but very much folded in and brought into the family. And one of the things that I had read too in this George Marsden book about Jonathan Edwards, he was talking about the idea of patriarchy, that fathers, of course, were head of the home, head of the family, that anybody, even slaves and servants, were folded into that family and protected by the patriarchy. And so that was the case for Phillis Wheatley. She really became a family member and was loved and cared for by the Wheatleys. And she writes this poem. How old was she when she wrote? Let's see. She was born in 1753, so maybe like 16, 17 years old. She writes this poem about George Whitefield, who was a famous evangelist that I hopefully will mention tomorrow in class when we talk about Jonathan Edwards, who comes over to London and just becomes this celebrity in his own right, traveling around New England, preaching and teaching with hundreds and thousands of people, revival all over the New England coast. And when he dies, Phillis Wheatley writes a poem about him, kind of eulogizes him in a poem. And it gets published. And because she becomes famous for this poem, and she's just a teenager, probably around the same age as you guys. Let me read you one of her poems. This poem is, I'll just read a paragraph. It's called On Being Brought from Africa to America. So she writes this great poem See, I forgot I have slides. Hold on. Let me see if I can advance this next slide. See, I'm terrible at slides. There we go. Here's more information. Have I told you everything? American Journey. She's named after the ship that brought her from Africa. Purchased by the Wheatleys, upper class, Bostonian family. She was around the age 8. I know I said all this, so I'm just going through the slide. And you know what's interesting is that they kind of guessed her age. They thought she might be 7 or 8 because she was losing some teeth that are generally lost around that age. So they kind of guessed her age. Didn't know. Was immersed in the classics. Okay, so shortly after she writes this poem about George Whitefield, this evangelist from London, from England, she has other poetry and she wants to be published. But there are people that don't believe that she, a slave and a teenager, essentially, although considered a woman in this time period, didn't really believe that she had written these poems. And so she has to go before an examination board. And there's 18 officials there. And there's no record of the questions they asked, but they probably asked her all kinds of questions, probably drilled her on maybe things that she had memorized from her classic studies, probably asked her all kinds of questions about things that she had read, her knowledge of poetry, to determine whether or not she actually wrote the poetry. And in fact, all of these people verified in her published work that she indeed was this prolific poet. Interestingly enough, some of the people that were examining her, one of them was the governor of Massachusetts at the time. I mean, some very well-known, famous people. There were several signers of the Declaration later, several years down the road, who were present to examine her. Fascinating woman. I mean, she really crossed paths with a lot of really important, famous people that we know. George Washington had read some of her poetry and commended her as a wonderful poet. So pretty interesting lady. So in 1772, she has this examination, has to stand before these people. They do indeed approve her as a poet and recognize that these poems that she has written could be from her. So here's a little snippet of a poem that she wrote. The poem is titled "On Being Brought from Africa to America." Just listen to the kind of the meter, the rhythm that you hear. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught me benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye," end quote. "Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train." So this is a stanza of her poem, one of her poems, Being Brought from Africa to America, where she talks about how because she was brought to America, she was able to discover Christ. The Wheatleys brought her to the Lord. And she talks about redemption. A really neat poem. So her, one of the Wheatley's sons takes her over to London to get published, where she meets all kinds of nobility. She is even set up to meet the king, but that falls through. It doesn't actually happen. But they really treat her as this special young woman who is a really acclaimed poet. And so she is in London. She gets her literature published. Let me see if I have a picture of that right here. There's a picture of the cover. I think it's stamped by the Library of Congress. Looks like a later date. It was actually published in 1772, I think, because right after that, she was freed. The Wheatley family free her. She's no longer a slave for the family. A troubling fact is that not long after that, the Wheatleys both pass away, the mother and the father. In fact, they hear of Mrs. Wheatley's illness, and they get back on a ship to go back to America to make it in time for her passing, and she dies. Mr. Wheatley dies. And sadly, Phillis Wheatley, her adulthood is kind of doesn't really match her younger years. She falls into obscurity as a poet. There's a lot of tumult, as you know, in the American colonies at this time. And she's been freed. She marries a man, I think his name was Peter, and he is eventually imprisoned for debt. Both of their two children die very young. In fact, the second one dies right before her own death. And so she dies when she's only 31 years old. Very, very young. So a very interesting life. And she leaves behind this legacy of poetry from the early colonial years that it's really fascinating and interesting to read. So the poem that you're going to read today is called, or this week rather, is called On Virtue. And let me just give you a little bit of tidbit about this. This is a beautiful poem. And I'll just give you kind of the overall theme so that you can kind of read it with those eyes. It's really a poem about conversion, about salvation. It's called On Virtue. And a lot of people connect this with Jonathan Edwards' sermon that he has published about virtue. He actually has it published in Boston, which is where Phillis Wheatley lives with the Wheatleys. Not far from where she lives is his publication house. And so she probably read Jonathan Edwards' sermon, and people surmise that this is a poem maybe in response to this sermon. So it's very short, very brief. It's called On Virtue. And the big question is, what is virtue and where does it come from? Is it something that we manufacture? Is it something that is supernatural? That is something given to us by the Holy Spirit? And so Phillis writes this poem. It's really a beautiful poem. And let me just pull it up really quick so we can look at it. So let me stop sharing here. I'm going to grab On Virtue from our Google Classroom. So here it is under our Colonial and Early Republic category, On Virtue. Let's pull this up. So I'm going to have you read this multiple times this week. Once just to kind of, you just want to read a poem the first time just to really glean the beauty, to just hear the beauty of the poem. And the second time, begin to look for meaning. And the third time, really kind of try to nail down what it's saying and understand maybe the devices and techniques that the poet has used, listening for rhyme and things like that. Okay, so she's going to talk about how she's striving for virtue, but she can't attain it. She can't reach it on her own. And from the Christian faith, we understand this. We know that we cannot attain virtue, that our virtue is not of ourselves. It is of Christ. And so that's kind of what she's starting off by saying. And then she's going to compare virtue to something. She's going to use a metaphor. See if you can find that and pull that out. And she's going to call virtue a couple different things: greatness, goodness. And then at the end, she says, teach me a better strain, a noble lay. So that in that way, that word means like the lay of the land. Teach me a nobler way or path or direction, right? O thou enthroned with cherubs in the realms of day. So read through this poem several times. One, looking for the beauty. Two, really trying to understand what she's actually saying. And then three, to kind of analyze perhaps what technique she's using. Again, she was exposed to a lot of classical works and understood a lot of the way that poetry worked, different mechanics and things like that. So what is she using as a poet? What is she going after? Is there any rhyme? Is there any rhythm? Might not be, as in other poems that we've looked at, like Anne Bradstreet. You might see a couplet. I don't know. Just take a look and see. Is there any kind of internal rhyme or assonance or consonants? Is there any alliteration? Is there any metaphor being used? What image is being pulled out? So just have fun kind of looking at the poem and seeing what technique she's using. I hope you enjoyed that poem. It's a great one. That's a little tidbit on Phillis Wheatley. God bless you. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next Thursday. Go.